I spoke to Laura Dawson, president of the Dawson Strategic, and she's an international scholar who advises governments on economic trade issues. She told me this.
It's been a great deal for all parties. It really did everything it set out to do. It increased trade by a great deal over the last 20 years. Most importantly, what it did was it reduced trade barriers, not just tariff barriers, but non-tariff barriers as well. It made us a really well-functioning, integrated economy, and in fact, it was one of the first comprehensive free trade agreements in the world that sort of set the model for what we see now in other agreements.
Laura, can I ask what the problem was in 1994, why Canada perhaps was hesitant?
Well, one of the things about the NAFTA was it was bringing together two fairly developed, fairly similar types of trading partners, together with Mexico, which was a developing country, and not only that, but really was having a lot of economic problems at the time. It had gone through a lot of fiscal, monetary crisis. It was in a process of democratic consolidation. Canadians in particular didn't really see why they ought to be trading with Mexico, or perhaps getting embedded in an economy where there wasn't a lot of trade. But I have to tell you that 20 years later, we're singing a different tune. Canada really needs trade with emerging markets, in particular Mexico. So what we're looking at now is market diversification. And frankly, we're pretty glad that those years ago we got involved in this deeply integrative agreement with Mexico.
Critics might argue perhaps that even without a free trade agreement, that trade was already good with the United States, and you would have had a lot of trade with Mexico naturally without a free trade agreement over the last couple of decades. Might that be true?
Sure, we would have continued to have found a way to trade. Businesses are always good. You know, willing buyers and willing sellers will always find each other. But what you need trade agreements for, what governments need to get involved with, is to reduce the transaction costs, to make things easier and simpler for things like inspection and certification and health and safety standards for food and consumer products. By having an integrated trade agreement, what you can do is make sure that you have the same rules applied in the same places, that you have a similar system for settling disputes, and so that makes it cheaper for businesses to do business with each other across borders, and also it reduces transaction costs and makes us all more competitive. So we would have traded anyway, but we wouldn't have been as efficient and as competitive.
Fair enough. Canada has grown a tremendous amount over the last couple of decades, America as well, but Mexico, it's a little bit of a different story. When this agreement was signed, there was a lot of expectations that this would push basically Mexico into the sort of next millennium at that time, but looking back, they really haven't experienced the type of growth that the other two countries have, and I'm just wondering to you, why is that?
Well, Mexico really needed to play catch up. It really was going from a country with relatively low levels of industrialization, with a very inward-looking economy where there was lots of domestic protectionism, where there wasn't a lot of engagement with export markets, and it has become one of the largest exporters in Latin America. So even though, if you look at the absolute numbers over the last 20 years, they haven't taken off, what they've done is done things very well in terms of getting their economic house in order. So now having a very outward-oriented economy that's integrated in international supply chains, especially in things like the auto sector, the aerospace sector, the food sector, cement, etc., they're really poised to go. And what makes it even more important is that they are a young and growing economy. In the United States and Canada, we're old. We're getting older, and our economies may not be shrinking, but they're not growing anywhere near the rate of emerging economies. So Mexico is in the chute, and it's poised to become one of the great growth economies. It's going to be what's pulling the U.S. and Canada along in the coming years. But that's only if we get our act together up north. And update that agreement, because that's the problem with it, Philip. It's a 20-year-old agreement, and we haven't done a heck of a lot to update it and improve it. It was an agreement that was negotiated before the internet, before electronic exchange of services, before a lot of the features that we now accept in the modern economy were even in operation. So we need to update that NAFTA so it continues to perform for us.